So, just 13 months ago, Ethiopia's Prime Minister was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But now critics say Abiy Ahmed is leading his nation into war. The northern Tigray region, there thousands of civilians are on the move, fleeing 2 weeks of fighting between rebel forces from the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the government. Now, there are accusations of atrocities on both sides. The United Nations is already warning of possible war crimes. Tonight on the France 24 debate, the war in Tigray, what's the endgame? Join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. And tonight we are very pleased to welcome to the debate Ethiopia's ambassador to France, Henok Tefera, and from Washington, D.C., Aluha Solomon, the CEO of the Tigray news outlet Tigray Media House. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much for being on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
There's clearly a lot to discuss. I want to talk to both of you very shortly, but just before I do, I want to play a report from our team on the ground at the Sudanese border. Have a look at this report.
It's 5:30 a.m. These Ethiopian refugees wake up after a night spent on the ground without shelter to protect themselves. Some are waiting for a UN bus to transfer them to a new camp. They would give anything to leave the city of Hamdayet.
We are in the desert. You'll see. The night was so cold, but we only expect from the people, from the government, food and sheltering. Those things are basic and fundamental things to the person.
At midday, new refugees are arriving in large numbers. The region is particularly difficult to access. NGOs are slowly setting up and getting ready to help an increasing number of refugees. This organization quickly built latrines for several thousand people.
التبرز في العراء ده مشاكل جمة يعني حسي لو شايفين احنا من جينا الناس دي بتبرز في العراء كانوا فكل الحاجات دي بتنزل في الخور السكريته دي بتنزل في الخور وبتنزل في المويه بتاعتهم اللي بيشربوها فدي بتسبب لهم امراض كثيره حتى للناس الغاطنين.
Since the beginning of the conflict, Sudanese organizations started collecting funds from the local population.
هذه المجتمعات ساهمت مساهمة كبيرة جدا في مجال تغذية اللاجئين وطالبي اللجوء وبعد ذلك طبعا جاءت المنظمات استلمت هذا البرنامج منظمة WFP ومنظمة مسلم إيد.
5:30 p.m. a meal is being served for hundreds of people. This will allow them to hold up until they are transferred to a permanent camp. As the night settles in, temperatures are falling again. The Sudanese government is expecting that 200,000 Ethiopians could cross the border in the coming weeks.
All right, our team on the Sudanese border there. Mr. Ambassador, let me bring you in first, if I may. The United Nations says a full-scale humanitarian crisis is underway in northern Tigray. There are harrowing reports from civilians who fled. What are government troops doing?
Well, the government, of course, is responding swiftly in order to make sure that the necessary steps are taken to avail humanitarian access and protection to civilians. This situation, this unfortunate situation was imposed on us after the brutal and treacherous killings of our soldiers and officers in the Northern Command by the TPLF junta. So this situation is really unfortunate. We are working speedily to make sure that everything on the ground gets running and humanitarian relief is delivered. And as you well know, the situation now is changing rapidly with many areas being liberated. Once these are secure, humanitarian relief can enter. And of course, our people also can return back to their homes and the normal course of life can take hold.
Yeah, and I want to give Mr. Solomon a chance to respond to that. But just before I do, you say you're doing everything you can in the Ethiopian government to protect civilians, to provide humanitarian support. If that is the case, why has your government imposed a communications blackout, making it impossible for journalists to verify what's going on the ground?
The communication blackout was imposed by the TPLF junta itself. You may recall that when they attacked our bases, the federal forces bases in the north, treacherously, they said themselves that they cut the communications and electricity. So it's not us who cut communications. But having said that, there's no point in belaboring this matter. The most important thing is that humanitarian relief gets there. Everything is being undertaken by the government to make sure that it gets there. And we are very much hopeful with the progress on the ground that this can be done very quickly.
All right, Mr. Solomon, let me bring you on that. The ambassador there saying they're doing everything they can to protect civilians, and in fact that it is the Tigray forces that have cut communications. What's your response?
I think that's that's not true. What's happening right now on the ground is actually not only a civil war, but it's transforming itself into kind of ethnic cleansing, genocide, declare population. Humanitarian assistance workers are denied access to the region. We have now around 30,000 Ethiopians from Tigray escaped violence and crossed the border to Sudan. They don't have shelter, no food, no basic needs are provided. So it's really difficult. A Nobel Peace Prize winner, dictator in Ethiopia, unelected since October 5, 2020, is now leading his country to, kind of a civil war. On top of that, he's declaring genocide against an entire population of Tigray, and he's unleashing all his forces, all his allies. He has the Amhara militia, the Amhara special force. He actually also has the Eritrean government support and drone attacks from the United Arab Emirates. What's happening right now is actually very different from what the ambassador tried to claim.
All right, Mr. Solomon, you've made a lot of claims there. I will give the ambassador a chance to respond, but just before I do, I want to make it very clear. You're not denying, though, that the Tigrayan forces are themselves committing atrocities on the ground. Witnesses talking about an incident on November the 9th where they say Tigrayan forces were slaughtering civilians. And so if I may, not right now, but when you can, if you have some headphones, that'd be great. There's a bit of an echo on your line.
Right.
Mr. Solomon, Mr. Solomon, I was asking you. You made a lot of allegations that I will put.
That's not the allegations are not supported by practice. What has happened in that certain village of Maikadra is a communal clash. Actually, most of the deaths are from the Tigray side. When the troops, the special force of Tigray left the village, and before the military took over, there was a gap in between, and then the Amhara forces took this opportunity and slaughtered a lot of Tigrayans before they fled to Sudan. It was a communal clash. It was a clash between communities with different ethnic backgrounds. It was not committed by a certain army or group. So that's what I can tell you. I have been monitoring. I have been following the situation on the ground since we have contacts there. It's close to the border of Sudan. We've been using Sudanese number to contact people. What they have told us is actually different from what the government is trying to claim.
Well, let me bring the ambassador back in on that, if I may. I'm sorry to cut across you, but we don't have a lot of time. Mr. Ambassador, suggestions there that actually the Tigray forces may not have been involved in crimes on the ground. What's your response to what you've been hearing?
It's really sad and very unfortunate. I mean, you can have a right to your own opinion, but you cannot have a right to your own facts. And the facts are known. The facts as established by Amnesty International itself, which cannot be accused of being pro-government. Amnesty interviewed witnesses. These witnesses, multiple witnesses, were very clear. There were attacks committed by the fleeing TPLF forces, the defeated TPLF forces, before fleeing, massacred people, not using bullets, but using atrocious means to slaughter their own compatriots. This, in any form, cannot be acceptable in any civilized country. So please, let's not enter into unnecessary debates and falsehoods. This has been clearly established. It will be investigated, and believe me, it will also be prosecuted, and those responsible will be brought in front of a court of law. This cannot be acceptable in any case.
Mr. Ambassador, though, let me ask you a little bit about the blocking of roads inside the Tigray region. I know you've already said that there are plans to bring in food for those in need, but at the moment, why is food and medicine being prevented from getting into the region? I understand borders there have been closed since the 4th of November.
Well, it's, first of all, the areas have to be secure. Secondly, as you know, and as was reported, the TPLF junta is purposely destroying infrastructure in order to stop the advance of our troops. But as I said, we are well now on progress to making sure that food and aid is delivered. That will be delivered very quickly. And as the situation stabilizes, and especially as the operations winds up, which we believe will wind up in a couple of days, things will get back to normal.
A couple of days, does that strike you as a realistic timeline, Mr. Solomon, based on the people that you are able to speak to on the ground?
Actually, first I want to comment on what the ambassador was trying to claim. That's also very false. But actually, our witnessing is a genocide declared on entire population. He was telling us that the people in Tigray are not denied access to aid, but that's not true. What we have actually are trying to get information from the capital Addis. Tigrayan, ethnic Tigrayans are expelled from all federal offices. They are expelled from civil aviation. They are expelled from security and intelligence. They are ethnically targeted, profiled. They are, the government has been also seeking, expulsion of ethnic Tigrayans from different UN agencies, including the WFP. On top of this, now it's almost becoming very difficult to live in the country in Ethiopia as a Tigrayan. You are not allowed. If you are a Tigrayan, you are not allowed to live in the country. We have more than 51,000 civilians arrested in Addis and surrounding. So what the ambassador was trying to do is actually a propaganda mission that is being given by the government to all of the diplomats.
All right, Mr. Solomon, if I may, you've made that allegation that genocide is already being committed in the Tigray region. Can I ask you very straightforwardly, though, given that the communications have been cut, whether that is by the Tigrayan forces or by the government forces, how are you able to make an allegation of genocide if we're not able to speak to people on the ground?
Well, we have people who have fled Ethiopia, the Tigray region. They cross border to Sudan. We have communication with these people. They are using Sudanese number, and we are also trying to use, we are trying to collect information from journalists, from the international media, that an entire population is choked up and denied any access to humanitarian assistance. That tells you a lot. So regarding the disconnection of telephone and internet, actually this scenario is not a new. This phenomena is not a new practice with regard to the federal government. It had disconnected internet telecom service in previous times. For example, if you remember, following the assassination of the famed Oromo artist Hachalu Hundessa, the entire nation was disconnected from telecom internet service. Now we have telecom, phone service, and electricity disconnected. These all services are provided by the federal government, but now Tigray is not receiving all these services.
All right, well, let me bring the ambassador back in on that. I'll give you a chance to respond to that, Mr. Ambassador, but I also want to ask you, as we don't have a lot of time left, you are the official representative of the Ethiopian government here in France. Abiy Ahmed, your prime minister, has been much celebrated on the international stage in the last year. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Is Ethiopia's image on the world stage about to change, and significantly for the worse?
I don't think so. I think, to the contrary, Ethiopia's image and the Prime Minister's image will be greatly enhanced once this operation is over. You have to understand what took place in Ethiopia on November 5th. What took place in Ethiopia is basically an act of murder against people who were not expecting it, some of them in their sleep. What would a French citizen say, madam, if you had people attacking a French police station, seizing the weapon, killing the policemen inside? Would you call for a negotiation with those who are the assailants? I don't think so.
Well,
so really, we have to be very reasonable and very. Let me finish. I let Mr. Alula finish. Let's let
the ambassador finish, Mr. Solomon. Please, I will give you a chance to reply shortly.
We have to be very clear about what happened. This government was very patient when the TPLF went. The TPLF leadership, in particular, went out of its way to basically to derail the political democratization process in the country. We also know that the TPLF was behind
Mr. Solomon, I will let you speak very shortly.
2.5 years, trying to destabilize the government. All that the government tolerated. But a big red line, was crossed when they came out and killed cold-blooded killings of people who were there to protect the region, who were there to protect the country's sovereignty.
All right,
this is unacceptable.
Mr. Ambassador,
by any means.
thank you very much
and
indeed. We are running out of time.
Know that because you also hold in high regard your own military.
I want to give Mr. Solomon a chance to respond because we don't have a lot of time. Mr. Solomon, it's clear you have things that you want to say. Tell me briefly, if you can, what's your response?
Okay, the ambassador cannot justify the killings in different parts of the country. It's not only in Tigray. People are killed. Even recently, 2 days ago, 7 people are killed in Wolaga, in the Oromia region. The military, the army have been killing civilians in every part of the country under the name of special command posts. So he cannot justify army attack for civil war, for unleashing the force on entire population, committing genocide on entire population. You cannot bring army attack as a justification for all these atrocities that have been committed by dictator Abiy across all
Mr.
parts
Alula Solomon, thank you very much indeed. Mr. Ambassador Hanuk Tefera, thank you very much as well. We are unfortunately going to have to leave it there. Clearly, there's a lot to still discuss, and we will talk to some analysts in the second part of the France 24 debate. Thank you very much for watching. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome back then to part 2 of the France 24 debate, where we are discussing the escalating situation in Ethiopia. For the second half of our programme, we're going to be going to Addis Ababa to hear from William Davidson. He is a senior analyst at Crisis Group. And we'll also be going to Rome to hear from Letitia Bader. She is a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, Africa's division. Good evening to you both, and thank you for being on the programme.
Good evening.
Before we talk to both of you, I want to bring our viewers a little bit of a backgrounder on the situation, specifically which groups are involved and where they're fighting. Sharon Gaffney has been taking a look for us.
The Ethiopian army in the northern region of Tigray. The conflict between the central government in Addis Ababa and Tigrayan separatists is unfolding on 3 fronts. The Amhara region to the west and south, Afar to the east, and also to the north in Eritrea. As for the military forces present, on one side, government troops who are part of the Ethiopian National Defence Force. According to specialists at the Institute for Security Studies, the army is made up of 135,000 ground troops, backed up by 3,000 members of the Air Force. Among the weapons at the military's disposal are helicopter gunships, tanks and transport vehicles. The army is also supported by militia forces from the Amhara region, a state that's had frequent tensions with Tigray. On the opposing side are separatist forces led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which dominated Ethiopia's military and political life for decades. According to Addis Ababa, it's made up of 20,000 commandos as well as 230,000 reservists and armed civilians. It also includes 15,000 former Ethiopian soldiers based in the north of the country who brought with them some of the heavy weaponry that rebels had been lacking. To the north, Eritrea supports the central government in Addis Ababa. Separatists say troops and tanks were sent from Asmara to help the Ethiopian army. Other sources say the country allowed Ethiopian troops to enter its territory. Officially, the border between Sudan and the Tigray region is closed, but Khartoum had close ties with the area during the rule of former President Omar al-Bashir. Sudan also has an old territorial dispute with Addis Ababa and could support Tigrayan separatists in order to put pressure on the Ethiopian government.
All right, well, let's talk to our guests who I introduced a little bit earlier. Let me bring in first William Davidson, who is in Addis Ababa for us tonight. First of all, sir, in the first half of our debate, we heard a really quite tense exchange of views between the Ethiopian ambassador to France and to a representative from the Tigrayan community. I mean, words like genocide and war crimes are already being thrown around by both sides. From your understanding at this stage, is there evidence that war crimes is taking place?
At the moment, it's very hard to be certain about anything that's occurring on the ground. But what we have had is very strong evidence that there was a very serious mass killing committed in Western Tigray, which I'm sure your participants were referencing. The problem is that there is claim and counter-claim about exactly who the perpetrators of that attack that was reported to kill up to 500 civilians were. So that does seem to constitute a very serious crime, but we can't be sure who committed it. And we also know there's been a campaign of aerial bombardment. But again, because of the difficulty of ascertaining exactly what is occurring on the ground, whilst we know that that aerial bombardment has taken place, claims, for example, from the TPLF side that there have been civilians killed in those airstrikes, those cannot be verified yet. So we know this is a very serious conflict, and there have been some very, very serious crimes committed. But at the moment, we cannot establish exactly what has occurred.
And that is because of the communications blackout on the ground. Letitia Bader, let me bring you in. On that communications blackout, I wonder, first of all, because there was some discussion about it during the first part, who was responsible for that communications blackout, and if you expect the fighting to get worse in the coming days?
Well, I mean, I think, again, coming back to the points which William was making, I think it's very difficult to really understand and get a sense of the reality on the ground right now, and also what to expect in the coming days. I mean, we have been receiving reports that there has been an escalation, that there have been increasing crisis and conflict in a whole range of towns. I mean, it does appear that the fighting has spread to other parts of the Tigray region, even though at the beginning it was predominantly, or not only in the western part of the region, but all again, I mean, very difficult to ascertain where the truth lies, given the communications shutdown. And I think, again, coming back to the question you posed, and you started off by asking William, I mean, we are trying to investigate both the allegations of widespread killings and injuries to civilians a week ago. Very difficult to really get to the bottom of what happened there, but also, again, allegations of airstrikes and also strikes on civilian infrastructure. But I think, this whole discussion of who is behind the communication shutdown, I think what is important right now is that there is much more transparency, and there is immediately much more space especially for humanitarian actors right now, to be able to have access to the ground to really understand what the needs are.
Indeed, because we do at least understand today that humanitarians in Sudan saying borders are closed. It's very hard to get food and medicine into civilians in need in the Tigray region. William Davidson, let me bring you back in on the question of what the response has been and perhaps should be from the international community. goes without saying that the Trump administration has been very withdrawn from foreign policy and African policy in general. We'll have a new administration coming into the White House relatively shortly. Should we expect a more engaged US foreign policy when it comes to Ethiopia, or is this going to be out of sight, out of mind, do you think?
Well, for now, what we're seeing is the occasional statement or tweet of support, particularly from Secretary of State Pompeo. That's in support largely of the federal government and condemning the Tigray leadership, its ruling party, the TPLF, for example, instigating the war by attacking the federal military, as it's described, or sending a missile at Eritrea's capital, Asmara. So it's fairly clear which way the Trump administration is leaning there. And then because we are in a transitional period in the US, it really will depend about events on the ground as to how the Biden administration tackles this. I think we should be clear from the beginning of this conflict, the federal government has, because they say the TPLF leadership attacked the military, which they indeed did, they say the TPLF leadership say as a preemptive move because they were about to be invaded. But the federal government has said there is no chance of negotiations here, and they are absolutely set on removing the TPLF leadership from power. Perhaps today and in the last couple of days more than ever, there is a sense that the federal forces are making rapid gains towards Tigray's capital, Mekelle. What we do not know is how strong the resistance from Tigray's forces will be in these last territorial strongholds. Could the federal forces face much stiffer resistance than they have elsewhere? And could we then be looking at a conflict is protracted? Yeah. If not, and this is over quickly, then it'll be a very different challenge for the Biden administration in terms of its policy towards Ethiopia.
Indeed, and Letitia Vadia, as we say, this could be a very protracted conflict indeed. The Ethiopian ambassador saying to me earlier he hoped it could be over in a few days. I don't know if you think that is a realistic timeline, but there has been a suggestion that I've read today that Ethiopia is a country that's sort of considered too big, too important to fail. 110 million people. If this does escalate and become a really protracted conflict, in your view, is it going to draw in other nearby nations?
I mean, I think the impact on neighbouring countries is already being felt. I mean, there's no doubt, of course, that thousands of Ethiopians who are arriving in Sudan, I mean, they're arriving in a part of Sudan which is quite volatile in itself. There's been an increase in intercommunal violence in Kassala state in particular over the last year. They're also arriving in an area where there is some very basic humanitarian infrastructure in place, but definitely not the sort of infrastructure which would be necessary. So, this is also something a Sudanese government, which is in itself in a transition, is going to have to deal with and could potentially create a whole range of dynamics, both humanitarian, but also within the political setup and transition in Sudan as well. So there is no doubt that this will and is already having regional implications. But I think also, on the whole question of what is happening now and where this fits into Ethiopia's own transition, I think it's very important to underline why there is inevitably a uniqueness to the tensions and now the crisis and the military escalation with the TPLF and in the Tigray region. We are also talking about a country where we have been faced for the last year, 18 months with a political and human rights crisis in many parts of the country. So a lot of the answers which are key to both dealing with the current tensions, but more generally are relevant throughout the country.
William Davison, I want to ask you a little bit about Eritrea. Obviously, the war with Ethiopia officially came to an end last year. That was something that Abiy Ahmed was much celebrated for in the international community. Is there a fear now that Eritrea could be drawn back in?
Yes, of course, there's a fear of that. But what seems to have occurred so far is that despite President Isaias and the Eritrean government really not making peace at all with the leadership in Tigray, which we can consider as their arch enemies. Despite that fact, Eritrea seems certainly set and determined to try and sit on the sidelines here. So providing some sort of logistical support to the Ethiopian federal forces, which have clearly been operating in southern Eritrea as they move into northern Ethiopia, into Tigray. But despite the TPLF claims of very intense Eritrean involvement, Eritrea's government has said that is not the case. So the point is that so far they have resisted the Tigrayan provocations, and so far Ethiopia's federal government has not felt the need to call upon its allies in Asmara for this intervention. That, of course, could change, but so far the Eritrean involvement has at least formally not materialized.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the international optics of this for the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. As I said, he was really celebrated, internationally, even winning the Nobel Peace Prize 13 months ago for making peace formally with Eritrea. Ms. Bader, are you surprised about the trajectory that his presidency has taken and him now sort of, along with the Tigray forces, moving the country towards the brink of civil war?
I mean, as I was just saying, I mean, we have been raising concerns and alarms around a whole range of situations in the country which the Abiy administration were not taking sufficient steps to deal with. I mean, I think maybe taking a bit of a step back. I think there was some very positive commitments by the Abiy administration in the first 4 or 5 months of his time in office. But I think a lot of those commitments have really not been followed through with. And so a lot of the political crisis and stalemate we are at, and we've now reached it in the Tigray region, but in other parts of the country as well, is very much due to the failure really of the administration to follow through. So on issues of accountability for past abuses, many of which were, of course, committed under a predominantly TPLF-dominated coalition in the country. So I think, for many of those of us working on Ethiopia, we have seen negative signs for some time, both in terms of the lack of follow-up to key commitments, but also in terms of a return to very heavy-handed responses to unrest in the country, also to intercommunal violence, large-scale arrests. I mean, here we're speaking also about a crisis in the Oromia region since July, where we have really seen sweeping arrests of predominantly Oromo communities in that area. So we really are already talking about a rights crisis. And I think what's interesting, I mean, there have been certain actors within the Western international community who have been much more outspoken and I think moved on from the honeymoon phase slightly earlier than others. But what is interesting in the last few days is seeing much more alarm also coming from the UN and the humanitarian community, specifically around the whole issue of lack of access to the Tigray region, and really, alarm bells being run around what could be an absolute humanitarian disaster.
All right, William Davidson, do you agree then with what we've been hearing there from Ms. Bader, that old ethnic grievances have sort of resurfaced under Abiy Ahmed's watch, and perhaps the international community was too quick to praise him, to give him that Nobel Prize, and in fact he had rather different intentions?
Well, yes, I mean, whether it's about intentions or not is difficult. And I think, it is important to remember that I think the Nobel Committee partly gave the prize as an encouragement to the Prime Minister to continue what they saw as a promising start. But when the peace deal was made with Eritrea, many people commented at the time that unless the Tigray leadership and the party there was really brought fully on board, then it would be hard to get a full normalization of relations there. And as many people in Tigray see it, the rapprochement between Eritrea and Ethiopia and the leaders, they see it simply as their enemy Isaias allying with a new leader in Addis Ababa, Abiy Ahmed, who ended up being an opponent of the Tigray leadership. So there was always work to do there. And then in terms of Ethiopia's political liberalization and this issue of ethnic tensions, we saw a period of anti-government protest that brought change in Ethiopia. That had quite a strong Oromo nationalist character to it. And then we had Abiy Ahmed come to power and this process of political liberalization. I mean, that was the collapse of a fairly authoritarian system that was run by a ruling coalition and in fact involved a considerable power struggle within the ruling coalition. That certainly unleashed a lot of political forces in Ethiopia, whether it's ethnic grievances, whether it's demands for self-determination, whether it's returning political constituencies which vehemently oppose the ethnic or multinational federal system. This transitional period involved a lot of actors with a lot of different interests. And what we've seen ultimately is a failure to peacefully and democratically manage that process. Instead, as Letitia was referencing, we've seen a return to authoritarian practices, the use of lethal force by security forces, the use of mass arrests, the use of judiciary to prosecute opposition leaders. And now finally, we are seeing this conflict in Tigray region. Certainly not just the fault of the federal government, and definitely also the fault of the Tigray political elites. But ultimately, this is a failure to peacefully manage what was a very challenging political transition.
I want to broaden this out again a little bit, if I may. I wonder, Letitia Beda, if you think this is really simply too outlandish a comparison. When I was reading earlier today, I saw a report suggesting that Ethiopia could become Africa's next Libya. That is to say, a place where all kinds of foreign powers, proxy wars are taking place, competing for resources inside the country. We are only 2 weeks into this conflict in the Tigray region. Do you have any sense that this could be as big and as dramatic as that at this stage?
Well, I'm not sure comparisons are particularly helpful. What is clear, I mean, as William was just pointing out, I mean, there's no doubt there are many different constituencies inside the country, but there are also many different international and regional actors with interests and potentially very, very different agendas in the country as well. So, I mean, I think there is no doubt that there are certain actors, the Gulf states, UAE, that we don't often discuss in Ethiopia per se. More broadly in the Horn, their involvement and often quite a negative role in terms of the kind of political negotiations which are happening between central and the regions in Somalia, for example, has often received a lot of attention. But there is no doubt that there are a whole multitude of actors right now. But what's also very clear is right now there are some very clear messaging which need to be coming from across the board to really avert the humanitarian disaster first and foremost, and to bring individuals back to a space where there can be some sort of political discussion and opening. And I think one of the concerns, obviously, which we've been raising for some time, is, as we know, since July, political leaders from much of the political spectrum with quite differing views on the future of the country are currently either in detention or facing charges. And so again, I think, in terms of how we bring the country back to a positive road in terms of the transition, it is very difficult to see right now. And that's why, ensuring that international actors across the board, and obviously also regional actors, I mean, the AU has expressed concerns on a number of occasions in the last 2 weeks as well, are really making some of those clear messages and unified messages.
All right, we have very little time left, unfortunately. William Davison, let me come to you finally and relatively briefly, if you can. We have talked about the local implications, the regional, perhaps the geopolitical implications of this. What, in your view, finally, do you think is the end game going to look like for Abiy Ahmed's government and for the Tigray forces?
There's two different scenarios here. One is that the federal forces push ahead and take control of the Tigray capital fairly quickly. That could lead to some sort of insurgency activity by TPLF remnants. But even if that doesn't occur, there will be the question of how to govern Tigray peacefully by a civilian government and get Tigray in a situation where the government can run elections there in June. The other scenario, of course, is that this conflict gets bogged down and Tigray puts up a considerable amount of resistance. In either scenario, what we need is a return to the sort of political process that Letitia was referring to. It seems very likely that there is going to be a considerable amount of opposition in Tigray to this federal intervention, even if it's relatively successful. Therefore, there is going to have to be some serious reckoning, not just with this incident, not just in Tigray, but with all of Ethiopia's fundamental political problems. That's going to have to involve parts of the TPLF. It's going to have to involve the people who have been jailed recently, who are important and influential members of the political opposition. Because unless we see that and we see a continuation of the government trying to impose its will on this very divided political landscape and society, then we are likely to see a continuation of Ethiopia's political turbulence and instability.
All right. A likely continuation then of instability and turbulence. We'll leave it, unfortunately, on that thought. Letitia Bader joining us from Rome, from Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much. And William Davison talking to us there from Addis Ababa, senior analyst at Crisis Group. Thank you both very much indeed for joining me for the second half of our debate on Ethiopia. Thanks to you for watching France 24. Do stay with us. Much more world news just after this break.